Our next speaker, who is now my dear friend through a shared traumatic experience, we both survived, I'd like to say I first encountered the work of Stephanie Brown when I was reviewing the extant literature on neural circuitry associated with human parental caregiving and nurturance behaviors, in the interest of trying to understand some of my own scientific results. It's a surprisingly sparse literature. Most of it is done on rodents and involves sort of lesioning areas and then seeing that they don't take care anymore. But encountering Stephanie's work, I was immediately sort of adopted her as a key intellectual ally, and now that we've survived the spontaneous channeling of Dr. Simpson together, I feel we are truly kin. Dr. Brown is an associate professor of preventative medicine at Stony Brook and adjunct professor at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. Her work focuses on how other-focused motivational states influence various measures of health and well-being, and sheds lights into the biological mechanisms underlying the caregiving motivational system, and further explains something about how these dynamics have implications for compassionate care, medicine, economic behavior, ethnic and international conflict, and other political attitudes and behaviors. This remarkably ambitious agenda, scientifically establishing the value of caregiving into virtually every important modern cultural construct and issue, earns my deepest respect. So with that, I'd like to welcome Stephanie Brown to the stage.
All right, so I'll start by defining my terms. What do I mean by compassion? In my talk today, I'm going to refer to compassion as the idea or the motivation really to help others. That's what I'm going to use, with all due respect to the fact that we absolutely need to nail down what exactly do we mean by compassion. So if we talk about compassion as the motivation to help others, whether or not we actually do, we might know some other pieces of information. Because we can learn about compassion through a theory that I worked on in graduate school called Selective investment theory, because it also addresses the motivation to help others. Now, selective investment theory is a theory of the adaptive significance, or an evolutionary theory of why we form social bonds or close relationships with others, why we feel attached or connected. And it challenges the traditional view, what I like to call what's in it for me view, of our bonds and our interpersonal interactions, that suggests that our bonds are really, and our attachments are really a way to stay close to people who meet our needs, to get our needs met. Because if we stay close to other people, we'll get more resources and rewards for ourselves than we would have if we were alone. And this seems very intuitive. And when it comes to something like compassion or empathy or helping, the traditional view in the behavioral sciences is to take even compassion and suggest that it was there to keep us close, maintain the glue of the relationship, maintain the benefits of reciprocal altruism, maintain benefits that we could ultimately gain for ourselves. So compassion really is seen as a means to an end at best. At worst, it's talked about as something exhausting, compassion fatigue, or right next to caregiver burnout and this heavy preoccupation with the costs of helping other people. So selective investment theory was developed to argue against this idea and to actually say that really, from an evolutionary perspective, it makes more sense to have our relationships and our bonds with others and a special motivational system to get us to suppress our self-interest when necessary, so that we can give our resources and what we need away to others. That's a much harder thing to do, so it makes sense for evolution to have shaped a mechanism to do this, to get us to suppress our self-interest. And the reason that we hypothesize a need for this mechanism to get us to suppress our self-interest is because we argue that such a thing has to happen in the case of parenting. You're talking about, in parenting, giving up valuable resources over time in the absence of reciprocity, sometimes risking death, in order to raise helpless offspring. And because of that, our helpless offspring simply would not be around and not survive, not reproduce without this mechanism. So we hypothesize that the origin of this sort of motivational apparatus for interpersonal connections really evolved to get you to give away your resources. It's got its basis in parenting and in the advantages of parental investment. And like other researchers, we've argued that in the case of humans, we're able to recruit this very ancient system, mammalian system, really, for parenting when we form relationships with non-relatives, when we're not parenting, when we're giving to people who might even be coworkers, so that this system can actually be activated, this hardwired ancient parenting system. Well, I don't have a lot of time to talk about the theory in detail, but I want to point out a couple of things about the theory. One is that what's critical about accessing this parenting system is that we have to have real or imagined signs of need, and we have to believe that the altruistic behavior that we engage in, or what we're about to do, is not going to be exploited. So we actually have to see evidence that the cues that we're seeing are authentic. So we're always constantly looking for authenticity in terms of activating this system. Because otherwise, if you have this parenting system generalized to everyone, which I think is a really interesting issue to ask whether we can feel compassion, maybe that doesn't lead to helping, or how broadly can we push this system? Because there would be significant costs associated with a generalized parenting system going off, giving our resources away to everyone else. So it's really critical that the threat of exploitation is low to activate this system. So implications. One is that compassion may exist in non-humans. Another is that what we know about parenting mechanisms could teach us something about human compassion. So as opposed to observational studies where we are, or our own intuition, or to the scholarship involved in going through, centuries of thought, looking at how people act and behave, there's an interesting alternative, which is one of the valuable aspects of having science enter this dialogue, is that we can do experiments and look to see how the brain might be structured. And maybe we can learn something from that can add some constraints to our discussion. So what do we know about mechanisms for parenting? Well, there are great animal models of parenting behavior in rats and other rodents. And what we know is that the motivation for the behavior is under the control of the hypothalamus. In particular, the medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus. I promise this is the most I'm going to go into brain regions, although I'll have a slide for anybody who's interested to just at least look at it, and I'm happy to talk to anyone after. But critically, the motivation under the guidance of the hypothalamus is activated by cues from other parts of the brain. In the animal model, it comes from olfactory cues from the amygdala, sort of like seeing a stress response or a threat response, activates the medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus leads to the parental investment, so like nest building, pup retrieval, protection of pups. It does it by inhibiting the competing stress response or the avoidance motivation, which would get you to eat the pup or kill the pup or run away from the pup otherwise. So it has to inhibit that. It has to downregulate that response. And it also has to inhibit the area of the brain that's responsible for reward seeking and consumption and addiction, the nucleus accumbens, if you've heard of it. Reward centers in the nucleus accumbens actually put a brake on our motor programs for helping. And so this area that's related to our own wanting and needing is putting a brake on these motor programs. Well, the hypothalamus has to release that brake by inhibiting that region, and that releases the ventral pallidum to engage in the motor behavior. So it is inhibiting reward-seeking behavior. And finally, the other critical aspect of this animal model is rather than being responsible for helping behavior, something like oxytocin, pregnancy hormones, what they do is they actually increase the chance of activating this neural circuit. They don't mediate the neural circuit because you can activate the neural circuit with males or juveniles or other instances where there has been no pregnancy, virgin animals. The circuit, it takes longer to get activated. It might require exposure and downregulation of the stress response, but it still can be activated so that the hormones or neuropeptides such as oxytocin likely prime the circuit but do not mediate the circuit. So this is the complicated model that I'm not going to spend much time talking about not much time talking about the neurobiology, but what I want to do is say that this model was developed out of consideration of the animal model of rats and other rodents that's been generalized to sheep and birds now, and considering human studies, neuroimaging studies of parental responses to infants that look like they activate the same network, and considering evolutionary models of what the system really needs to do. So this model actually has some interesting counterintuitive pieces to it that we might not be able to know ahead of time. For example, what I described before, that caregiving motivation, I call it caregiving motivation there, but I think we could use the word compassion in that box. So that's the box I want you to pay attention to when we think about compassion, the motivation to help. So the hypothalamus, the caregiving motivation, cannot lead to prosocial behavior or helping behavior unless it first inhibits stress or downregulates the stress. So with all due respect to quotes by Darwin and other other philosophical traditions that talk about how we're relieving suffering in others in order to relieve our own suffering, that this suggests actually, although the suffering of others may cause us suffering, we're actually not going to be able to help another person unless we relieve our suffering. So it suggests that relieving our suffering, relieving our stress, has to happen before you can activate the motor programs for helping. The other thing that's important to point out about this model is that if the cues for helping come in, that you could get to helping behavior. So if you see need, you can get to helping behavior without experiencing compassion, right? So this model, by considering the neural arrangement, the neural circuits, and how they mutually inhibit one another, suggests that we could either go through our compassionate motivation, that's regulated by the hypothalamus, or we can go through other sources of motivation, such as fear of punishment or desire to look good to others or coercion, and get to prosocial behavior in other ways. Whether we go through the hypothalamic side, the compassionate motivation, is hypothesized to be part of two aspects. The first, relationship variables. So instead of calling it maternal experience, because the neuropeptide oxytocin plays such a critical role, it's got receptors for in the medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus, because oxytocin plays a role in increasing the chance. We know from Sue Carter's work, her pioneering work, that oxytocin is really part of the neuroendocrine basis of affiliation. So it makes sense to think that this neuropeptide may also be priming the circuit in other instances, just in social relationships. And so in the context of close relationships, it may be more likely that we're going to activate this compassionate circuit, which is not to say it can't be activated in the absence. For example, with genuine, again, cues for exploitation have to be low, so genuine signals for need that are authentic, because we can't activate the system when there's a threat of exploitation. The other piece that I'll put under individual differences actually comes from the work that you just heard about, Stephen Porges' work on the polyvagal theory, the idea being that how can we invest our resources in others unless we have something to invest, unless we're in a position to give, and that cues for safety would be critical. Regulating your parasympathetic tone, the autonomic nervous system has to be in some way stable in order to facilitate the cues coming in turning into compassion as opposed to other sources. So when we're in this fight or flight mode or really stressed out or too stressed out, the argument is that if we're not feeling safe, these cues for need come in, we may feel like, oh gosh, I have to go do this, or I have to take my friend to the airport or they're going to scream at me. And we may still engage in the behavior, but it won't go through that route. Okay, so in testing some of the implications of this model, well, first of all, we're doing neuroimaging studies, we're doing cardiovascular studies, we're doing analyses of immune function. To give you an idea of some of the kinds of what findings have come out of these tests, we found that the hormonal correlates of relationship variables that reduce stress also trigger helping behavior. So a study that I conducted with Barb Fredrickson, who's also here and you'll hear from later, we showed that when you induce closeness between people, it increases the hormone progesterone, which can be triggered by oxytocin. And when progesterone increases, a week later when subjects come back and we look at how much progesterone they have, the more they report being willing to sacrifice or risk their life for the other person. Another study that set of studies that we have that we haven't published the data yet, where we continue to run different versions of this study. What we show over and over again, though, is that when you manipulate helping behavior, experimentally manipulate it under conditions of closeness or to tell people to be objective, we find that helping behavior accelerates recovery from a stress induction under conditions of closeness, but not when there's no closeness. And it's not just closeness, it's also you become vulnerable to one another, you become close, but you also engage in a perspective-taking technique where you're told and instructed to consider how that other person is feeling. So in that context, which I would call the compassion condition, we see that helping behavior is accelerating recovery from stress. Helping behavior is actually increasing stress in the other condition where there is no closeness and you're asked to be objective, which has implications for the medical context or healthcare, because you think about the guidelines of the AMA often encourage objectivity, and it's not clear that objectivity isn't necessarily going to help physicians to be recovering from their own stress in that context. I'm going to give you just an example by way of kind of concluding to show you sort of how we know what we know. One of the studies we recently did in collaboration really with Sue Carter's lab is that we suggested, based on our model, that oxytocin should be higher when individuals help someone that they care about, who they've gone through this closeness perspective-taking induction with, but not when individuals help someone they've objectified. In the design, we just had 3 groups. We randomly assigned them to this closeness perspective-taking condition, or no closeness objective perspective-taking condition, or to a control group where there was no helping and where there was no helping and no other person. And we measured their stress reactivity and recovery with autonomics, oxytocin in the blood, progesterone in the saliva, and immune function in collaboration with the Cancer Center at the University of Michigan. And what we found is that the red line shows you oxytocin before and after helping in the closeness condition, and it increases, whereas in the yellow line, oxytocin was going down when they still helped, but they did not feel close. You'll notice one thing that's time does not permit going into great detail on, but you might want to talk to Sue Carter about this. In the control condition where there was no other person, we actually see the highest levels of oxytocin, which are flatlined, and that's consistent with thinking about oxytocin as a marker of the stress response. That extreme stress that you can't regulate, you get high levels of oxytocin. This is a slide for our immune analyses. Transforming growth factor beta is a way to measure the turning on the inflammatory response, and we find here that it's going up when you're helping without compassion, going down when you're helping with compassion. Interleukin-8 is a marker of the pro-inflammatory response, also responsible for creating inflammation. It is going down when we're helping with compassion. And there are other findings in the study that I I won't go into, but they're very amazing because what happens is there's a correlation in the compassion condition of progesterone and oxytocin like we had expected, and the autonomics and the immune response. Those correlations disappear in the other two conditions. The implications for physical health are that if this is going on, we should expect that pro-social behavior, especially when motivated by compassion, should improve our physical health. Much of my work has been devoted to showing mortality effects as a function of helping others, that people who help others do live longer. They seem to have better health and better well-being compared to people who do not help. And this seems to have more explanatory power than the receiving social support hypothesis, that what you get is what allows you to live longer. A couple of the key predictions from the model I showed you is that the benefits of pro-social behavior should be strongest among those who are experiencing stress, because it's regulating stress, and also that the benefits should be stronger if you have truly other focused motives for helping. And across two studies, we've documented both of those, evidence for both of those predictions. Broader implications I don't have much time to talk about, but if you think about behavioral economics, you think about what capitalism is based on in concepts of rational self-interest, an entire economy built around an assumption about our behavior as maximizing self-interest, reward-seeking, benefit avoiding, cost avoiding. If the system is based around that, well, what happens when we learn that there's another system that is going on that is designed to maximize concern for others, and we know something about what triggers it, and we know something about how to turn it off? Maybe researchers might want to start considering this possibility when they're thinking about how to prevent economies from crashing, for example. And in terms of social problems, very grandiose, yes, there's no way somebody like me can come along and fix anything in this world. But I hope that the seeds for others to come along and begin to investigate these concepts, might help us think differently, at least, about what we're exposing ourselves to, what the environment we've engineered for ourselves. Because what we've done, first of all, this framework, if we're talking about cues for need, how authentic they are, whether people feel interdependent with one another, whether people have feelings of safety, all of which are going to, activate the system. Maybe when we think about a media that makes us feel very unsafe, makes us challenge their authenticity because they're interested in ratings and not necessarily in telling us the truth, paints everyone, highlights how mistrustful, how rotten people are. What's that doing to our ability to access compassion? And what does it mean when we're interacting socially with people on something like Facebook without the ability to get olfactory cues or non-olfactory cues from them, or when we're not exposed to need anymore, and when we're sending mass signals out that can be easily falsified with, a change in which letter you type on the keyboard. So I think we should start paying attention to this, and I'll conclude by saying time is of the essence. Thank you.